Hi, everyone, and welcome back to A Fork in Time. This is episode two of the Tex-Mex combination. I think this is going to be the combination number two. I am joined by Robert Koshu. Robert, you want to say hi to everyone?
Now, I won't do your thing and say hi to everyone. Hello, everybody. Glad you were joining us again.
I've recently been experimenting with saying I'm Chris Coppola and you are not. Kind of a Chevy Chase homage. So gonna jump right into this episode. This is a follow-on, as I mentioned earlier, to the previous episode where the United States, at the end of the Mexican-American War in 1847, decides to take the entire country of Mexico. Is that correct, Robert?
That's correct. Scott has occupied Mexico City. Santa Anna came in hat in hand and said, I'll take the money, and by the way, we'll let y'all have the country. And at that point, as you pointed out, Chris, the peninsulas, am I saying that correctly? Peninsuladas?
Peninsuladas.
Peninsuladas. Yeah, I grew up in Texas, and you'd think my Spanish would be better, and it is not. So they cut the deal to remain in power along with Scott and the others. And so we now have this huge Mexican territory that we're going to make some decisions about.
So going forward from there, the first thing that happened in our timeline, which we talked about and think would probably happen, is the Zachary Taylor presidency of 1848, correct?
Correct. So okay. Taylor still becomes president because, after all, old Rough and Ready had done a great job taking care of the northern part of the campaign for the Mexican-American War. Most people don't remember that because of Scott's brilliance in marching to Mexico City, but he goes and he basically defeats Santa Anna.
So he becomes president. How long does he last as president?
6 years. He is elected in 1848 and dies in 50. Is that correct? Oh, sorry, 2 years. 2 years.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm thinking an 8-year term, but no, 2 years. 2 years. He goes and eats a bunch of bad cherries and milk and catches something and dies.
So his vice president, Millard Fillmore, takes over. If anybody out there has any forks related to Millard Fillmore, please let us know. He's kind of one of those people who, I'm pretty sure he was president, but nobody knows anything else about. He's not really an entity.
I was just going to say, I think we've just said as much as most historians say on Millard Fillmore with that one sentence.
So going back, let's talk about the other important event of 1850, which was, in our timeline, the admission of California, right?
Correct.
And if early American history, whenever there's a free state admitted, there has to be a slave state admitted. This was the first time that was broken because the United States really wanted to get California in because of the gold rush.
Yep.
So this was one of those incidents, you always hear about leading up to the Civil War, because to get the southern states to agree to the admission of California, the U.S. government had to basically pass a Fugitive Slave Act, which basically extended, in some ways, at least from the northern perspective, extended slavery, made slavery federal policy, because now in states like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania that had abolished it, they were compelled to participate in the Southern slavery institution. That doesn't happen in this timeline, right?
No, yeah. There's no need for it. Because we've got all this land south of the border that we all agreed that basically everything to the southern part of Mexico, Mexico City south, is going to be slave because, by God, there is coffee, there is produce, and there is sugar cane down there, and we need all of that. And by the way, those are all very labor-intensive items. And so to do the labor-intensive items, I have to have my slave labor to do it.
So instead of balancing it out with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, how is it balanced out?
They basically say, hey, Travis becomes a state. The state of Travis is formed. And we talked a little bit about this off podcast about would it really be named Travis? And I'm like, oh, the Texans have convinced everybody that we're the only ones that understand Mexico. So we need to run it because we know how to do it. And Chris said it is a big middle finger to the Mexicans. I was like, yeah, because that's how the Texans would do it, actually. We would do it no other way. This is one of those, you killed Travis, so guess what? It is going to be Travis. And if you want a little bit more, we'll compromise. And the second state to be admitted, the territory of Crockett gets formed, because that appeases the Tennessee people.
So, you have the states of Travis and California at mid-1850. Millard Fillmore gracefully exits in 1852. And who is our new military hero waiting in the wings, who's basically created a settlement in Mexico that he can now leave and return to the U.S. as a conquering hero and run for president as
the grand old man of the army. Winfield Scott comes in, and how big a deal was Winfield Scott? The Army uniforms at West Point, the cadet uniforms, are the uniforms worn by his troops in the War of 1812. So he is even to this day. So he is even more revered than he was at the time. He actually was a candidate in the real world in 1852 and lost. But now we got this little thing that, oh yeah, we doubled the territory, made everybody happy, and conquered the hero. So guess what? Hey, he wins.
Okay. He wins, and what happens after that? How are things going down in Travis?
So Travis is not doing so well. So the Texans who are in charge decide that they need to have the Texas militia, the Travis Territorial Militia, really authorized. Well, there was a gentleman named William H. Wallace, or William A. Wallace, commonly referred to in the Texas Ranger lore as Bigfoot. Bigfoot was pretty famous. His brother and cousin had been killed at the Goliad Massacre. He basically comes to Texas at that point to say, I'm going to take pay out of the Mexicans for killing my brother. Participates in several battles during the Texas Republic era, including Salado Creek, the Hondo River, and the Muir Expedition. Texas decides to do a little small invasion of the northern part of Mexico, hoping to take it over at that point. It fails pretty miserably, but Santa Anna, who's back in charge somehow, Santa Anna, if you ever want to know anything about Santa Anna had more lives than a cat. He would always come back. So Santa Anna comes in and says, that done. They needed to draw beans. You need to kill 1 out of every 10 of them. They draw a bunch of beans out. If you draw a black bean, you get killed. You draw a white bean, you live. White bean gets drawn by Wallace. He gets marched down to Mexico City. The end of that, he joins up. He actually plays along with Scott and goes from Veracruz to Mexico City during the way. He fights off the Mexican guerrillas along the way. Of course, that colors him even more as far as what they are. While the Rangers are in Mexico, one of their number gets ambushed and killed one night, probably after he was out drinking more than he should have. The Texas Rangers, the next night, the Army starts rounding up dead Mexican bodies, somewhere around 150 of them, all of them killed by a ranger, very distinctive because the Rangers were the only ones shooting 5 revolver Colts at that moment. And so bullets were it made a distinctive hole. And so at that point, Wallace participated in that. Rumor has it he was a incredibly active participant. Remember, he wanted to take the payout. So he managed to make it. And so from Wallace's standpoint, the only good Mexican is a dead Mexican. Sam Houston is now the governor of Texas, the state of Texas. Sam decides he has no use for any of these crazy firebrands that were part of that part of Texas. So, of course, what does he do with all of them in good days? They all get sent down to Mexico to run Mexico. Travis, sorry, what we consider Mexico. Mm-hmm. So they're all down there running Travis. Wallace is the commander of the territorial militia. And of course, he's running around and seeing Mexican banditos everywhere he looks.
And at the same time, you do have what we described in the last episode as kind of a Peninsulares Criollo upper crust that is collaborating and is working with the Americans and is acting as kind of middlemen to try and work between the local population and the United States. And one of these people we're talking about now is a man named Jesus de Cardenas, who was actually the president of the Republic of Rio Grande. And that's a really interesting topic because that was another wannabe Texas almost.
Oh, definitely.
It was a republic that at the time that Santa Anna in Mexico City starts trying to centralize power, northern Mexico isn't on board with this. And Texas is successful in breaking away. The Republic of the Rio Grande isn't, but it wasn't for a lack of trying. So he's one of these people that we talked about that would be a wealthy, on board with the United States, a participant, mm-hmm. but still working with the local population.
Oh, definitely. The only problem is that Wallace doesn't see a difference between the Mexican peasants and the upper crust who's trying to negotiate. In his view, there's only one Mexican, and the only good one is the ones that are dead.
So you have this ongoing back and forth between the leadership of the Travis State Militia, Texans, and the civil administration in the state of Travis, which is a little more interested in hearts and minds. And as we talked about, what is the Texas idea of winning somebody's hearts and minds?
One in the head, one in the heart.
So Scott basically tries to keep the country together. Even in our timeline, although a Virginian, he did not go with his state. As president, he's trying to negotiate between these two forces because he sees we can't just absorb the entire territory of Mexico without some local help. But at the same time, so Scott is trying to keep these two people from killing each other. He succeeds for a time, but after he wins re-election, he no longer succeeds. So go ahead and talk about what we think happens.
Wallace basically gets fed up. He's tired. He's been running around killing peasants. Nothing is changing. They're still, according to him, raiding, robbing, doing things they aren't supposed to do. Mm-hmm. There was a huge segment of the Mexican population at that time who flat out refused to accept the fact that Texas was lost much less now the entire country was lost. And so he's tired. And how he views it is he views De Cardenas as basically, he's probably their leader in secret. He's double dealing because after all, what were all the other rulers in Mexico known for? Santa Anna in particular, double dealing. So Wallace captures in early 1857, late 1856, after the election, but somewhere in that time frame, Wallace captures and just assassinates De Cardenas. He's like, I'm done. We're going to end this.
And that kind of messes up all of Scott's plans, doesn't it?
Oh, now he's got a problem because now a territorial militia commander has killed. Not sure if he would have been, De Cardenas would have been the governor, or maybe someone else would have been the governor of the state. But De Cardenas was really in charge. There was a public face from the American side, but let's be real, De Cardenas was running it. So now he's got basically the lieutenant governor being killed by a member of the militia, and Wallace establishing himself as, okay, we're done. I am now in charge in this. And Scott can't put up with that. Scott is his nickname was Old Fuss and Feathers. It had to all be done right. It had to be done perfectly. And he had no time for nonsense in his command.
And this is certainly, depending upon how you look at it, this is an act of mutiny by a state militia.
Oh, right. Yeah, absolutely. He doesn't have time. So what does he do? What would you do if you were the old commander of the army and now commander in chief? Here comes the troops.
Call out the federal troops.
They get sent, and this isn't a Harper's Ferry where we got a group of Marine. We got a small platoon of Marines sitting here, and Robert E. Lee happens to be sitting by the side. So let's just go grab him. And he shows up. What most people don't realize at Harper's Ferry, Robert E. Lee is in a civilian suit. Stewart is there only because he happened to be in town at the time. And he's serving his aide to get. This is not that. This is not that. This is
a planned operation.
Full on U.S. military regiments sent down to take care of this situation.
And what is the reaction of certain pro-Bigfoot parts of the United States?
Well, let's start with the most common one everybody knows of, South Carolina. Calhoun goes nuts because this was not the deal. We were supposed to be allowed to take this over, make it a slave state. You were going to let us do it. You've let the Mexicans interfere from day one. Now, because one of our guys tried to take care of the situation and make it like it was supposed to be. Now you're sending the troops in. South Carolina goes. They're done. They finally secede. Followed very quickly by Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Texas stays put because Governor Houston, in this case, says, you know what? You have to march troops through here to get to down there. And by the way, Sam got rid of all the firebrands. They're all down in Travis now. Few are kind of over in,
They were more than happy to go down there because they could just do whatever they wanted in this new territory.
Yep.
But Sam's like, well, I'll buy you the ticket. I'll pay for you to get down there.
Look, hey, knock yourself out. Have a good time on your way down. So Sam says, he basically calls up Scott and says, hey, send the guys down, march through. By the way, on your way down, can you drop a couple of divisions off in Austin? Just in case I have problems.
He didn't get everybody. He didn't get all of the Texas firebrands.
East Texas, mainly because now we're in 1857, and there's one firebrand still in Texas who was alive. Mira B. Lamar. Lived actually in the Richmond area, Richmond-Rosenberg area, about 10 miles from me.
Mhm.
And he actually looks at everybody and says, Sam is crazy. These are our states. Travis was from Alabama. Crockett was from Tennessee. A lot of the eastern part of Texas are from Louisiana. Alabama, one of the big units that was in the Alamo was the New Orleans Grays.
Mhm.
And so these are our people. They have decided to do the right thing finally. So he forms a secessionist government over in East Texas, to kind of, and they supply a few troops.
Claims to be the legitimate government of Texas.
We're the government, not Sam in Austin, but us. Sam's only there because Scott dropped a bunch of troops off in Austin to take care of it. That's the only states that become Confederate, by the way, in our scenario. Virginia stays put. North Carolina stays put. Arkansas stays put because Arkansas don't want no part of this. Tennessee, Kentucky, all those states stay put.
Because this isn't. We talked about this. This is so much more of a flagrant issue. This isn't. There's arguments on either side about one way. This is rebellion that needs to be dealt with.
And Scott frames it that way. But part of the argument with secession in our timeline is it's an argument of states' rights. Do the states have the right to determine what happens within our states regarding slavery? Slavery is wrong and evil, but that is the core of the argument they use. In this timeline, it's you guys are seceding to support a guy who basically overthrew a state government.
This gets back to kind of that more almost like John Locke, Rousseau argument on the monopoly on the use of force.
Yes. Well, it's similar to the Whiskey Rebellion.
Okay.
Would be another good comparison where basically they said, we're going to do whatever we want. You're just the federal government. You don't have any control over us. And George Washington says, because George brewed beer. So George basically said, hold my beer. He calls up Daniel Morgan and says, Morgan, you and I are going to go take care of this real quick. By the way, bring Matt Anthony along, just because if they go totally crazy, we'll just cut him loose on. This is akin to that.
So we have we have an earlier Civil War, and we have a distinctly different one. A couple of the major players are shifted around. So, for example, do you want to talk about Scott in our timeline and his importance?
Yes. And our timeline, what Scott did, as Chris mentioned, he never formulated. Scott came up with the plan. He did two important things for the Civil War. The first one didn't work as well as he wanted. He immediately called Robert E. Lee and said, I want you to have command of the Union Army. Robert E. Lee says, I can't raise my sword against Virginia. Scott looks at him and says, you know what you have to do then. Lee immediately resigns his commission. There's another fork in time we have to do at some point where Lee actually takes command of the Union Army and decides to stay put because the war instantly became long at that point because now you don't have Robert E. Lee, who, by the way, was Scott's aide de camp all the way through Mexico. And pretty much did most of the major scouting, most of the major engineering deals. This was, it was as much Robert E. Lee as Scott coming up with ideas on things to do. Second thing Scott did is Scott designed what we called the Anaconda Plan. And it was, we're going to choke the Confederacy to death, blockade it on the sea, encircle and capture the Mississippi River, and basically strangle them. What a lot of people don't realize about Gettysburg, as much as Gettysburg was a run to take care of everybody, Gettysburg was also a get the war out of the South because the Shenandoah Valley needs to grow crops because our people, including the Army, are all starving. And the blockade, despite blockade running and everything else, was working at that point. And Robert E. Lee could see the writing on the wall.
So this was 63. This was a couple of
Yeah.
years into the war when this
Yep.
is happening. Initially, Scott, is one of these people. He talks about the Anaconda plan. He's also one of these people that's saying we're not going to walk to Richmond.
Oh no,
this is not going to be a quick one.
His exact words to a few of the people involved were, "The people around here have no idea what's fixing to happen," because he had seen war, and most of official Washington at the beginning of the Civil War thought the Civil War was going to be a parade.
So
knew better.
And this gets to the crux of the issue of what this Civil War we just created is all about. No matter what, in this country, the military is subordinate to the civilian authority.
Yep.
So in our timeline, Scott initially gets overruled by Lincoln, who's a little, at this point, amateur. He matures and adopts the Anaconda plan. Elements of it.
It just took a lot longer to get it going.
And now, though, Scott is. In this timeline, he is the civilian authority.
He puts on a two-pronged attack. He sends the troops down into Travis to take care of that situation, which, let's be real, it was a militia group, not the army. And as good as I would like to brag as our Texas Rangers are, it's just like the Alamo. At sheer force of numbers, force of numbers, you lose.
and reference I want a count of how many times I referenced this movie, Dr. Strangelove. I'm sure your base defense forces are very good, but my boys can brush them aside without too much problem.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's the Alamo.
Mm-hmm.
You can say 10 Texans are as good as 100 Mexicans, but if you've got 5 Texans and 600 Mexicans, you're still going to lose.
And the entire United States Army.
Yeah.
An organized military force. The Texans may have had their 5-shot revolvers. They don't have artillery.
But by then everybody had the 5 shots.
Mm-hmm.
They had adopted them. So by then, now it's over. Now you've got a problem.
And
so that's a quick campaign.
Okay.
But now we have another problem, because now we have Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina who are brandishing their stuff and saying, no, we are now we'll still call them the Confederate States of America. Capital is Mobile, by the way, where it originally started.
Okay.
But we are.
I'd say Montgomery.
Yeah,
it's
a
little safer.
Yeah, well, Montgomery Montgomery. So you come, that's right, because it was originally Montgomery, not Mobile. I've been through Mobile too many times and only been to Montgomery once. They're in Montgomery. But Scott says this is Anaconda time. So the first thing that happens, first major battle after the whole, we're going to go take care of because Scott also realizes I may not have enough troops to take care of Travis and this at the same time. So let me throw the Navy. Mm-hmm. The Navy goes ahead and does the blockading, takes control of the Mississippi. Mm-hmm. But the first major battle where we start capturing things is New Orleans. And it is just a wash. Because the South loses one important thing in all of this. There is one state that does not secede, that secedes in the original timeline that plays into this. And which North state Carolina. Is that? Not the second one, Chris, the other one. Not your home state.
Virginia.
Yeah.
And all of the talent pool.
Uh-huh. So, most importantly, who stays put? Scott's favorite son.
Lee, who would be put in charge of what we agreed and discussed would be the very likely overland campaign, the campaign of the United States Army against the Confederacy, which would be what?
It starts off, we go down because by the way, remember, Tennessee is not seceded. So it's Union at this point. Gosh darn, Chattanooga's in a great place. So Lee sets up headquarters in Chattanooga, brings all his people together. He looks at it and says, and he takes a look at Stuart, the cavalry boy, and Thomas Stonewall Jackson. And he says, boys, Atlanta looks nice.
You can't look at a map and not see it. If you cut right there, Atlanta and down to Savannah, you now have 3 different confederacies. You've got South Carolina, Georgia. Georgia's cut in half. You've got Florida, which we say Florida. What does Florida mean at this point? Florida is swamp.
Yeah. There's very little in Florida outside of St. Augustine and a couple of forts in the Keys.
Other half of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. And then on the other side of it, you've got the rest of Louisiana and whatever rump government of Texas.
Which, by the way, that section of Louisiana and Texas, that's all pretty much swamp except for the wooded areas around Texas. And Sam is an old warrior like Scott. Sam's not going to have time to mess with that. Because guess who else stayed home? Because he was a good friend. Albert Sidney Johnston. Sam takes Albert Sidney. He comes in, takes care of the Travis group, and then he turns Albert Sidney Johnston loose on the rump government. Albert Sidney Johnston's plantation, well, it was more of a ranch than a plantation, China Grove, it was in Brazoria County, which would have been slightly southeast of where Lamar set up his government in the Fort Bend County area where he lived. And so they cut Johnston off from his plantation.
I'm reminded of kind of what happens to Arlington. That strikes me right now as something. Yeah.
And Johnston was another one of those old Army guys. Johnston is one of the only people in the history of the world. He was a general, like 4-star, or what was considered 4-star at the time, because we didn't get 3 stars that often. But the only person that served as general in 3 armies. He was Army General-in-Chief of the Republic of Texas Army. He was a major general. He commanded the Department of California, actually, at the start of the Civil War.
Our Civil War.
Yeah, the original Civil War. And he also was a major general in the Confederate Army, commanded the Department of the Mississippi Army, and was killed at Shiloh. So Johnston don't have time for this. He goes and he just destroys them. And so that part of Texas is messed over. Johnston cuts across the Gulf Coast. Johnston does the mopping up that Lee's doing. And then in my mind, Lee, after he gets to Savannah, he marches to Montgomery. Johnston comes up from the Mobile area and they meet the 2 of them meet in Montgomery.
Okay.
And take out the Confederacy.
So when
2
is this?
years, no more than 1859.
Okay.
At the latest. I mean, they don't have time for this.
Right. So it's 1859. The
Civil War's ended.
State governments of South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana are not state governments anymore.
Or Travis, for that matter.
Or Travis. So what shapes up with the election of 1860?
Well, Lincoln is once again a candidate, because Lincoln, part of the reason Lincoln ended up being a one-term congressman, you alluded to it last time, Chris, Lincoln wanted to know exactly where the wet feet were in the Rio Grande at the start of the Mexican-American War. And he comes back and he says from the beginning, I said at the beginning, this was going to bring nothing but trouble on the country. The Whigs have been in power for 12 years, and look what happened. A much less bloody civil war, but still significant deaths, significant problems. We still ended up marching federal troops through parts of the Deep South to shut everything down. And they are now, by the way, those states are now all occupied by federal troops.
Yes.
So,
yes.
And there is no with malice towards none and charity for all Lincoln speech. This is Scott, who you guys mutinied. The federal troops are in the governor's mansion.
And that's the other
state
thing
capitals
that we were thinking about here, which is while it's not the national catharsis and trauma that our Civil War was, this is still, it's almost as if the affront to the American principles of civilian government are that much worse than what happened in our timeline. Now, we kind of alluded to it on one of the last episodes we did, which was the Peninsula Campaign.
Yep.
If you don't have the long drawn out war, and this is always an argument you hear about with Lincoln, which is how much in his early presidency, he said, if I could keep the Union together without freeing a single slave, I would. If I could free them all and keep it together, I would. That's a debate as to whether that's Lincoln saying that just so that he can keep Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri on side, or whether that's honestly where he was at this point and evolved over time. The argument that because of the length and the difficulty of our Civil War, it necessitated abolition.
Yeah, and this Civil War, as much as it was and was not that bloody in depth, it was not. It was over slavery, but not really over slavery. This was over a group that basically just decided we're going to run the government. Doesn't matter what anybody else says. So we're going to rebel and take it over. By the way, and a bunch of other states just joined in because, well, we're scared.
And by the way, that is kind of the northern perspective of the South going into our Civil War because of the Fugitive Slave Act, of them trying to control places that they've got no say over.
Right.
So the more I think about this election of 1860, the more I'm a little reminded of almost Attlee's election in 1945, where the war's over. We as a nation and as a people want to put this behind us. So let's go with think about it. The Conservatives' last election was at least 10 years before. So we're going to go in a very different direction at the end of this war, especially without the hardcore South being able to vote. Do we still have an Abraham Lincoln elected in 1860?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Because part of it is, can he pull his coalition together?
Okay.
With, do you think, we got to this point, we kept talking about it. We could never decide, I don't remember.
I think he does. I think
you're thinking he wins. Okay. I can buy that because I think in either direction works. But there is no Deep South.
Right.
Texas votes because there is enough in Texas, and Sam has enough influence
But
that guys, we got to tone it down.
Mm-hmm. But between even I'm going to say core north, without taking into account any of the mid-Atlantic or any of these states that did wind up staying with the U.S., he still can garner enough support amongst free soilers to win.
Well, because free soil becomes the deal. The Homestead Act changes everything. Right. Chris, tell them what the Homestead Act, because now the Homestead Act has a little different twist to it. Because slavery is still an issue. We just got to find a different way to deal with it.
I think looking at it the way it would have appeared in our 1860, let me stress that. It is an issue we need to deal with, but we aren't involved in an active war against it. So the way it happens in our timeline isn't going to work out. If they were to move towards it, you would see not only the occupied core southern states resist even harder, you would see that start bleeding over into some of the newer border states of Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky. So one of the things that went through my mind was this. The Homestead Act was passed in 1862 by, again, a Northern-dominated
definitely Northern
Congress.
Dominated. Yep.
An entirely Northern Congress. And what it did was it granted anybody who moved to generally the Western territories, it granted them land as long as they worked it. That is how the West happened. That's how you got people out there. In this scenario, I said, well,
and not only that, but you also have some bunch of land down in Mexico that needs to be, in addition to our plains, there's land down in Mexico too that needs to be settled. We have more land to settle than we had in our timeline.
The issue with
anglicized.
That's the other thing. The United States, when it went out into what are our West, just pushed the people there further out. That's that much harder in the South.
Oh, yes.
In these new territories. But the idea we talked about was, well, you work it, you have 10 years to accumulate wealth, and then there's almost a bond payment to the government about it. You've had a chance to accumulate some wealth, and now you can buy this land outright. What does the government use that money for?
That money gets paid to the slave owners as compensation for their slaves.
And any freedman is welcome to move out west as well. They won't have this bond payment. And that way, it's eased out of these border states. It was dying out already in a lot of these areas. The soil was dying out, and this is a good way for some Southern slaveholders, to get out of that racket, to cash out.
Well, it's a way out because in the deep South, the Army enforces it. It's done down there. It's the other groups that we've got to appease. We have to keep Virginia happy. Probably Virginia more than any other group.
Absolutely.
We've got to keep the Virginia. Robert E. Lee on one level wanted to free his slaves when he took over the Arlington estate from his father-in-law, but there was also no money to let the slaves go and hire people at the same time. And so we've got to take care of those situations to keep these guys intact, as it were.
Okay.
And so to keep them all happy and around, they get freed.
So we're up to where we kind of stopped, but we're nowhere near the end of history. So what happens after that with the U.S. territories down in Mexico?
Crockett stays formed. They eventually become states. But I think you and I talked about the one thing I think the offer of we're going to pay any slaves off doesn't apply down there.
No.
Because you guys started this.
I honestly think it doesn't apply in any rebellion areas.
Yeah. Yeah, I would
Deep
totally
South
agree
included.
with that. Yeah. Yeah, it's not there for sure. And so now we've let this piece go. Mexico forms, and Mexico becomes weirdly more important because Mexico has some oil to it in the future.
So as an independent state or as a series of U.S. states?
Series of U.S. states.
Okay.
I think we talked about where we would combine and what they would become. Didn't come up with names for any more except Travis and Crockett. But
I do feel like the naming them after people at the Alamo is probably done, though.
Oh,
like at a certain point, you're going to run out of people that were at the Alamo to keep naming states after.
You get those two. Everything else gets named something different.
Okay. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if Travis gets renamed Cardenas.
I could see that. Had they reestablish it. Because that appeases to the ruling Mexican class. Because I think that group, people know that we have to have them on board to really govern this. I mean, we're gonna anglicize it, but there's still a huge Mexican population down there. And it's not the Plains Indians where they're running around nomadic. The Plains Indians were nomads. They moved around. They didn't have established cities. The Mexicans have established cities and towns and all of that. So we have to get them on board.
Columbus had cities bigger than London.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Mexico City was huge at that point. Aztec, but yes. So definitely so. But those actually.
Okay.
Definitely. I think we end up with 5, maybe 6 states down there, maybe 8 total over time. But definitively more.
Okay. Any other thoughts you have? I'd be interested to think in our timeline, one of the things that allows a Jim Crow to exist is because there was such a recalcitrant chunk of the South.
Well, it's part of the way that existed because of also how Reconstruction was handled. It was heavy-handed. It was done. But then after a brief period of heavy-handedness, it was brought back and let go. I think the heavy-handedness stays in and shuts it down.
In the areas where it applies.
Yes, absolutely.
Because you don't have to apply it as widely.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And so you basically shut it down.
Okay.
You don't have time. So Jim Crow doesn't exist because I also think what you end up with the southern to northern migration.
Okay.
That occurs in the free black. Yeah.
And Western.
But it becomes a Western migration.
Okay.
So those states establish part of the Jim Crow. Jim Crow wasn't just in the South. There was some northern Jim Crow stuff too. Part of that was a reaction to the southern migration, the northern migration of African Americans to the cities in the North.
Right.
Hence the Detroit riots and all of those in the Civil Rights era. the migration occurs more west. So
Mhm.
the West is now more African American than it
Okay.
is in our time frame.
Mhm.
And because that's there, Jim Crow never really happens
Okay.
to the extent it does. I think that
Okay.
sets up, which that then becomes totally different for how politics in the 1940s through today work.
Okay. Yeah.
That becomes an entirely different world. Woodrow Wilson never becomes president in this timeline.
Right. Well, he does of Princeton University. That's about it.
Yeah.
Okay. Um. So we've got a really different country at this point. Yeah.
Oh yes.
Okay. Any other thoughts you
I
have?
don't think so. I think that pretty
Okay.
much puts a bow on, because now we've got a United States that extends down to Central America. If we don't even take Central America, which that would be a whole nother thought, I think maybe we end up with Cuba.
Okay.
If we've got the Yucatan and we've got Florida, why would we not have Cuba? After the Spanish American War, we basically we follow the Mexican rule with Cuba after the
Okay.
Spanish American War.
And we've
It's
got
ours.
a lot more of a population there that can work with us.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. So it becomes American empire at that point.
What do you think about Panama?
We probably just go down and take it over.
Is the
we just cut
canal
through
in Panama?
The canal is still in Panama. No, I think it's still in Panama.
Okay. The reason I'm asking is there was another semi-viable route.
Yeah.
Yes.
Panama was still much more engineering-wise viable.
Okay.
Than Nicaragua. Okay. But the difference is it's not a Panama Canal zone.
It's the state of Panama.
Yeah. Maybe we just go ahead and bump through Nicaragua, grab Panama, maybe chip El Salvador while we're at it, and all of that down to Panama becomes basically from Panama north through the current United States, including Cuba, are the United States.
Okay. What does that... We've talked about what it does to kind of traditional American concepts of race being binary, African Americans and European Americans, but what does that do to the United States in terms of a complexion of the country?
Well, now we are much browner, so now we have a black, brown, white complexion. We have a brown complexion anyway, but Southern immigration becomes a non-starter because we're all one country.
It's all internal migration.
Yeah, it's all internal migration.
Your great migration to the industrial areas of Detroit may not be African Americans. It may be Hispanics.
Right. Do we also, at the same time, do we end up not having the do we have drug cartels?
Okay.
Because all of that exists because of the way the Mexican economy or the Mexican government economy works, which is it is run by payola and corruptness.
Here's the other question.
I think that stays. I think that doesn't come into play.
Looking at the history of drug laws in the United States, the prohibitions have largely been put in place because of fear of
organized crime.
No, doped up farm workers. If you looked at when it came in, almost if you look at drugs that were made illegal, they were targeted at certain groups. If those groups are much larger in this country, maybe much more geographically dispersed, and have full voting rights, maybe that's not even something.
Not even an issue?
Right. It could be that, you know what? Those are just marijuana is just another crop they grow.
That is possible with this, because they're gonna change that entire change. That changes everything.
Yeah.
As we move through it, totally changes everything.
Yeah. So I think we've got a really, really interesting fork here.
This is one of those forks that. How does that also affect world economics and world policy? Because now the U.S. is truly everything but Canada.
Yeah.
So the Cold War takes on a whole nother color because Cuba's not there. Now I've already messed with him.
Well,
it doesn't become Cuba. You don't have Nicaragua.
But how anglicized are these states?
I think they go along to get along.
Okay.
At that point, they adopt American ways. At that point,
I'm not convinced. I think you have a very strong, assuming, and by the way, this is a huge assumption that everything else in the world works out the same way.
Yeah.
You've got first thing is, in the United States, you've got anti-imperialist tendencies that start coming out in the 1890s when we start taking Cuba and the Philippines. And then you've got at least a propagandistic anti-imperialism coming out of Russia. Go ask Kiev right now how anti-imperialist Russia is. But at least they're making that argument. And I don't know if they don't find a bit of a receptive audience in the southern United States in this case.
So this work. I think it ends up with worldwide implications, because part of it is you don't have the Zimmerman telegraph in World War I even.
Yes.
Unless you're going to telegraph Brazil and tell them you can have all of it, but I don't see that being.
And that's something else we might get to eventually, is because we've definitely got some ideas in the topic hopper about the survival of Brazil. How I think you're familiar with Confederados, who were real diehards that went to Brazil so that they could keep owning people.
All right. Or at the same time, does Brazil and Argentina merge and come together in because of the mid to late 1940s
threat from the north? Yeah, this is all really interesting. Eventually we have to end this episode, so I'm picking right now to do it.
I think it works.
So I want to thank everyone for your time listening to us. If you have any ideas, please feel free to reach out to us for new suggestions. Like us, give us 5-star ratings, support us on Patreon. I've heard the first episode is actually already released for those members. So we'll try and get this up for those of you that are Patreon supporters. We do appreciate that. And just on our way out, Robert, if you should come to a fork in the road, what should one do?
Look for the right way to go, which is never a way to head.
All right. Signing off.